What idiotic rule did your parents make up that cost them their lives? I was giving our golden retriever Doodle his medicine when my dad ripped the pill bottle away from my hand. Stop babying that dog. He's never going to get better if you keep coddling him. Doodle had been sick for 2 weeks with some kind of stomach issue. The vet prescribed medicine that had to be administered every day, but apparently that was wrong according to my parents' new philosophy about independence. From now on, the dog takes care of himself. That's how animals in the wild do it. Dad tossed the pills on the counter. Mom nodded along enthusiastically. You're making him weak. Dogs have natural healing abilities when we don't interfere. I stared at them in disbelief. Doodle was 12 years old and had been throwing up for days before I finally convinced them to take him to the vet. Now they wanted him to heal himself like some kind of wolf in the wilderness. But I knew better than to argue when they got like this. The next morning, Doodle was whimpering by his empty food bowl. See? He's not even that hungry. You were overfeeding him, Mom said proudly. By day 3, I found him lying in the bathroom on the cool tiles, panting heavily. When I tried to give him water from my hand, Dad caught me. What did we say? Let nature take its course. Nature's course apparently involved Doodle vomiting bile on the living room carpet. Mom just sprayed some Febreze and declared that he was purging the weakness. A week into their new independence program, Doodle could barely walk. His ribs were showing and his golden fur had lost all shine. He spent most of the day sleeping in dark corners. When he did move, it was with this weird, stiff walk that made my stomach twist with worry. He's building character, Dad announced at dinner while Doodle lay motionless in the corner. That's when Doodle started acting strange. Not sick strange, but different. He'd stare at my parents for long periods without blinking. His lips would curl back, showing his teeth in what wasn't quite a smile. When Dad walked by, Doodle would track his movements with laser focus. Look, he's getting his spirit back, Mom celebrated, but I noticed the foam, just a little at first around his mouth. Doodle had started drooling excessively and pawing at his face. He'd snap at invisible things in the air and growl at shadows. His eyes had taken on this glassy, unfocused quality that sent chills down my spine. 2 weeks after the medication stopped, Doodle seemed to rally. He was suddenly energetic in a frantic, manic way. He paced the house endlessly and barked at nothing. My parents were thrilled, thinking their tough love had worked. See? We told you he just needed to fight through it himself. Dad reached down to pat Doodle's head. That's when everything changed. Doodle's personality shifted like someone had flipped a switch. The sweet dog who'd slept in my bed since I was 5 was gone. In his place was something wild and dangerous. He'd bare his teeth at any movement and lunge at people walking by. It's just a phase. He's re-establishing his dominance, Mom explained as Doodle cornered the mailman. The aggression got worse daily. Doodle attacked his own reflection in windows. He chewed through his leash and destroyed furniture. Strange noises came from his throat like nothing I'd heard before, guttural sounds that raised the hair on my neck. My parents finally started looking concerned when Doodle tried to bite the neighbor's kid through the fence. The boy was just walking by when Doodle went ballistic, slamming against the chain link and snapping wildly. Foam flew from his mouth as he barked himself hoarse. Maybe we should call the vet, Mom suggested nervously. No! We committed to this. He's almost better, Dad insisted. That night I heard Doodle prowling the hallway. He was growling. White foam was pouring out of his mouth and there was blood on the floor. I grabbed my phone but my fingers wouldn't work right. They kept slipping on the screen and I had to try 3 times just to get the passcode in. Doodle's growling got louder and deeper, like something was stuck in his throat. I could hear his claws scratching against the hallway wall, leaving marks I knew would be there in the morning. I backed up slowly until my legs hit the bed, and then I moved sideways toward the door. My whole body was shaking as I pushed the door closed as quietly as I could. The click of the latch sounded incredibly loud in the silence between Doodle's growls. I pressed my back against the door and just stood there breathing hard, my phone still in my hand with the emergency screen pulled up. Through the door I heard Dad's voice yelling at Doodle to go lay down. But he didn't sound angry like usual. He sounded scared, really scared, and that made everything worse because Dad never sounded like that. Mom was crying somewhere in the house, saying something I couldn't make out clearly. Then I heard Dad's voice again, sharper this time, telling her it was just the adjustment period and to stop being dramatic. Mom said something about calling the vet, but Dad cut her off completely. I heard their bedroom door slam, and then everything got quiet except for Doodle's pacing in the hallway. I pulled up my messages and texted my best friend asking if I could stay at his house tomorrow. I didn't explain why because I didn't know how to explain any of this. He texted back immediately asking if everything was okay, and I just said yeah, family stuff. Then I locked my door and pushed my desk chair under the doorknob like I'd seen in movies. I sat on my bed with my back against the wall and started searching Doodle's symptoms on my phone. I typed in foaming mouth and aggression in dogs, and the results made my stomach hurt. Every single article mentioned rabies. I read about how it attacks the brain and makes animals violent and confused. I read about how there's no cure once symptoms start, and how it's almost always fatal. The article said rabies makes dogs afraid of water and sensitive to light and sound. I thought about how Doodle had been avoiding his water bowl and hiding in dark corners. I found a veterinary emergency hotline number and saved it in my contacts even though I knew Dad would never let me call it. My hands were still shaking as I scrolled through page after page of information. Every symptom matched exactly what was happening to Doodle. The excessive drooling, the aggression, the weird stiff walk, the foaming at the mouth. It all fit perfectly, and I felt sick knowing what that meant. I stayed awake most of the night listening to Doodle move around downstairs. When morning finally came, I heard Dad leave for work early, his truck starting up in the driveway. I waited a few more minutes before opening my door carefully. Doodle was lying in the corner of the living room completely still. His eyes were open, but he wasn't really looking at anything. His breathing was fast and shallow, like he'd been running. I walked past him slowly, keeping as much distance as possible, and found Mom in the kitchen. She was making coffee, but her hands were shaking so bad the spoon kept hitting the sides of the mug. I showed her my phone with all the articles about rabies pulled up. She glanced at the screen and then looked away fast, like she couldn't stand to see it. She said Dad would be furious if we went behind his back to the vet. I told her Doodle was dying and she knew it. She just shook her head and said Dad promised it was almost over, that Doodle was getting better. I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe that at all. She was terrified, but she was more scared of Dad's reaction than of what was happening to Doodle. At the school, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept checking my phone every few minutes to see if Mom had texted. During lunch, I walked straight to the counselor's office without even thinking about it. The secretary said I needed an appointment, but then Buchanan came out of her office. She took one look at my face and told the secretary it was fine. She pulled me into her private office and closed the door. I told her everything about Doodle, and how my parents stopped his medicine and how he was showing rabies symptoms now. I told her about the foaming and the aggression, and how I was scared to sleep in my own house. She listened to everything without interrupting once, just nodding and taking notes. When I finished, she explained that animal welfare situations can involve child protective services if the home becomes dangerous. She asked me really specific questions about whether I felt safe sleeping there, and if Doodle could get into my room. I admitted I'd been pushing my desk against the door at night, and sleeping with my baseball bat next to the bed just in case. Her face got serious when I said that. She wrote something down on her notepad and then looked up at me. She made me promise to call her personal cell phone if anything got worse tonight. Then she explained mandated reporting laws and said she had to document our conversation in case authorities got involved later. Part of me felt relieved that an adult finally believed me and was taking this seriously. But another part of me was scared about what would happen when my parents found out I'd talked to someone. She gave me her card with her cell number written on the back in pen. When I got home, Doodle was pacing the living room in that stiff, weird way with his head hanging down low. Dad was sitting on the couch just watching him with this stubborn look on his face, like he was determined to prove everyone wrong no matter what happened. Mom was in the kitchen cooking 3 different meals at the same time, even though it was only 4 in the afternoon and nobody was hungry. The house smelled like garlic and onions and something burning. I went straight to my room and did my homework with my door closed. That night, I woke up to Doodle snarling downstairs. It sounded different from before, more vicious and desperate. I heard Mom screaming and then the bathroom door slamming. Doodle was attacking the bathroom door where Mom had locked herself inside. Dad was yelling at him to stop, but I didn't hear him doing anything to actually restrain Doodle. I grabbed my phone and started recording, capturing the sounds of Doodle's snarling and the door splintering under his weight. I could hear Mom crying through the door and Dad yelling useless commands. The recording went on for almost 3 minutes before Doodle finally stopped and went quiet. I saved the video and sent it to myself in 3 different places so my parents couldn't delete it. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm went off and waited in bed until I heard Dad's shower running upstairs. I crept down to the kitchen as quietly as possible and started opening cabinets one by one, looking for where he'd hidden Doodle's medication bottles. I found them shoved behind the cereal boxes on the top shelf where I could barely reach them. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and photographed every label, making sure to capture the dosage instructions and the big red warning sticker that said complete entire course of treatment. There were 3 different bottles and I took multiple photos of each one from different angles, so you could read everything clearly. Then I opened my email app and sent all the photos to myself with the subject line evidence, in case my parents tried to go through my phone later and delete them. I could hear the shower turn off upstairs, so I shoved the bottles back behind the cereal and ran back to my room just as Dad's footsteps creaked across the hallway above me. At the school, I went straight to Liesel's office during my free period before first class even started. She was drinking coffee at her desk when I knocked, and she waved me in immediately. I pulled up the videos from last night on my phone and showed her Doodle snarling and attacking the bathroom door with Mom screaming inside. Her face went completely white as she watched, and her coffee mug froze halfway to her mouth. Then I showed her the photos of the medication bottles with all the warnings about finishing the treatment. She set her mug down carefully and picked up her desk phone without saying anything to me first. She dialed a number from memory and asked for Dr. Wolf, then explained who she was and that she had a student with serious concerns about a sick dog. Dr. Wolf must have agreed to talk because Liesel handed me the phone and nodded for me to explain everything. I described Doodle's symptoms in as much detail as I could remember, including the foaming and aggression and the weird stiff way he walked now. Dr. Wolf asked me to hold on a second, and I heard her typing something into a computer. When she came back on the line, her voice sounded really serious, and she asked me specific questions about whether Doodle had actually bitten anyone, or if there had been any contact with his saliva on broken skin. I told her about how he almost bit the mailman, and how he went crazy at the neighbor's kid through the fence. She was typing the whole time I talked, and I could hear the keyboard clicking rapidly in the background. She asked me the neighbor's name, and I told her it was Jeffrey Hudson, and his son was maybe 7 or 8 years old. Then Dr. Wolf explained that she was required by law to report suspected rabies cases to animal control within 24 hours, and that once she filed the report, they would need to quarantine Doodle for observation. She said my parents could face serious legal trouble for refusing to give him his medication and letting him get this sick. I felt this weird mix of relief and terror, knowing that adults were finally going to do something, but also knowing my parents would blame me for everything. After I hung up with Dr. Wolf, I gave the phone back to Liesel, and she asked if I felt safe going home that afternoon. I told her honestly that I didn't know anymore. She wrote something in her notes and said we should meet again tomorrow to check in. During lunch period, I went to the school library instead of the cafeteria and logged onto one of the public computers. I searched for county animal control procedures and rabies protocols and spent 40 minutes reading through official documents and health department websites. I learned that once a rabies report gets filed, the animal control officers can get a warrant to take the animal if the owners refuse to cooperate. There were specific laws about dangerous animals and public health emergencies. I found the relevant county codes and sent them to the library printer, then folded the papers carefully and tucked them into my backpack. My stomach felt tight and anxious, like I was preparing for some kind of battle I didn't know how to fight. When I got home that afternoon, there was a white notice taped to our front door with official-looking letterhead at the top. I only got to read the first few lines before Dad's truck pulled into the driveway behind me. He jumped out and ripped the notice down before I could finish reading it. He crumpled it in his fist and muttered something about nosy neighbors who couldn't mind their own business. Mom opened the front door and asked what the paper said, but Dad just pushed past her into the house without answering. I heard him stomping down to his workshop in the garage and slamming the door. Mom looked at me with this helpless expression and went back inside. I waited on the porch for a few minutes until I heard the power tools start up in the garage. Then I went inside and found the crumpled notice in the trash can where Dad had thrown it. I smoothed it out carefully on the kitchen counter and took photos with my phone. The notice was from the County Animal Control Office, and it listed an officer named Barnaby Capps as the person investigating our case. There was a case number and a phone number and a deadline for my parents to respond by tomorrow afternoon. The notice said something about mandatory quarantine protocols for animals showing signs of aggression and warned that failure to comply would result in legal action. I took 3 photos to make sure I got everything, then threw the paper back in the trash exactly how I found it. That evening, I told my parents I needed to go to the library to work on a school project. Dad barely looked up from his dinner and Mom just nodded. I rode my bike to the public library and used one of their computers to create a new email account that wasn't connected to my name. Then I logged into that account and wrote an email to the address listed on the animal control notice. I attached all the videos of Doodle's aggression and the photos of the medication bottles. I explained that my parents had stopped giving our dog his prescribed medicine and that he was now showing what looked like rabies symptoms. I wrote that Dr. Wolf was our vet and could confirm everything, and I included the exact dates when the medication was stopped. My hands were sweating, so badly I had to wipe them on my jeans twice while typing. When I hit send, I felt this rush of fear and relief all mixed together. I deleted my browser history and logged out of the email account and rode home in the dark. The next day at the school, I was exhausted from barely sleeping. During third period, my backpack fell off my desk and everything spilled out, including the printed county codes about animal control procedures. Dad must have gone through my stuff that morning because when I got home, he was waiting in the living room holding those papers. He started yelling before I even got my shoes off, asking what I thought I was doing researching rabies and printing out laws about dangerous animals. His face was red and he kept saying I was betraying the family and trying to get him in trouble with the authorities. He asked if I was the one who contacted animal control, and I didn't answer, which made him even angrier. He grabbed my laptop off the coffee table and took my phone right out of my hand. He said I'd lost the privilege of privacy until I could be trusted to be loyal to my own family. Mom was standing in the kitchen doorway watching, but she didn't say anything to stop him. Without my phone, I felt completely cut off from everyone, like I was trapped in the house with no way to call for help. I found an old notebook in my desk drawer and started writing everything down, including times and dates and exactly what my parents said about Doodle. I hid the notebook under my mattress where I didn't think they'd look. The next day at the school, I borrowed my friend Martin's phone during lunch and texted Liesel that my parents had taken my devices. She texted back immediately asking if I was safe, and I said yes for now. That evening, while I was doing homework in my room, I heard the house phone ring downstairs. Dad answered it, and I could tell from his tone that something was wrong. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened to him talking to someone about me and school and family stress. It was Liesel calling to request a meeting about my emotional state. I could hear Dad getting defensive, saying I was being dramatic and that they were handling a difficult situation with their sick dog. He tried to refuse the meeting, but Liesel must have insisted because Dad's voice got tighter, and he said fine, they would figure out a time. When he hung up, he looked up and saw me on the stairs. He didn't say anything, but his expression made it clear he knew I'd been talking to people at the school about what was happening at home. 2 days later, someone knocked on the front door while I was doing homework in my room. I heard Dad answer it and recognized Mr. Capps' voice, immediately asking about our dog's welfare. My stomach dropped and I crept to the top of the stairs to listen. Dad put on this smooth, calm voice and said Doodle was doing much better and resting comfortably in his bed. Mr. Capps asked if he could see the dog to verify his condition for the report. Dad paused for just a second, then said, Doodle was actually at a grooming appointment right now getting cleaned up. I could see Mr. Capps from my position on the stairs and watched him glance past Dad to our driveway where our car was clearly parked. He looked back at Dad with this expression that showed he knew it was a lie. Mr. Capps pulled out a tablet and started typing notes, while Dad stood there in the doorway getting more tense by the second. The animal control officer asked when Doodle would be back from this grooming appointment, and Dad said probably in a few hours. Mr. Capps nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an official-looking document. He handed it to Dad and explained it was a formal warning notice requiring us to produce Doodle for examination within 48 hours. If we failed to comply, he would return with a warrant and law enforcement. Dad took the paper with a tight smile and said that wouldn't be necessary because Doodle was fine. Mr. Capps looked past Dad into our house one more time, then walked back to his truck. I watched through the window as he sat in the driver's seat for a minute, writing more notes before starting the engine. As soon as his truck disappeared down the street, Dad spun around and saw me on the stairs. His face turned red and he started yelling about betrayal and loyalty. He came up the steps fast asking if I was the one who called animal control on my own family. His voice was shaking with anger, and he kept saying I was trying to get him arrested and ruin everything. I didn't answer, which seemed to make him even more mad. He grabbed my phone off my desk and took my laptop too, saying I'd lost the right to privacy. Mom stood in the hallway watching but didn't say anything to stop him. After Dad went back downstairs, Mom waited a few minutes, then came to my room. She closed the door quietly and whispered that she was scared Doodle was going to hurt someone. Her hands were shaking, and she admitted she'd looked up rabies symptoms on her phone, and everything matched what was happening to Doodle. But she was afraid of what would happen to our family if Dad got arrested for animal cruelty. I told her that was better than someone dying because we did nothing. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she knew I was right, but she didn't know how to stop Dad when he got like this. That night I was in bed when I heard a loud crash from downstairs. Then another crash and the sound of metal hitting the floor. I opened my door and heard Doodle making these awful snarling noises mixed with the sound of garbage being torn apart. I ran down the stairs and found Doodle in the kitchen surrounded by trash he'd pulled from the can. The baby gate Dad had set up was broken in 2 pieces on the floor. White foam dripped from Doodle's mouth as he ripped through old food containers and paper. Dad came running from the living room and tried to grab Doodle's collar to pull him away from the mess. Doodle whipped his head around and snapped at Dad's hand. His teeth came so close I saw Dad jerk his arm back just in time. Dad stumbled backward and I saw something I'd never seen before. Pure fear in his eyes. He held his hand against his chest even though Doodle hadn't actually bitten him and his whole body was shaking. He told Mom to get the leash, but his voice came out weak and scared instead of commanding like usual. Mom was frantically searching the coat closet, but couldn't find the leash fast enough. Doodle finished with the trash and turned toward Dad. He started walking forward slowly with his teeth showing and his head lowered. That horrible guttural sound came from deep in his throat. Dad kept backing up until he hit the wall and had nowhere else to go. Mom was crying now, saying she couldn't find the leash anywhere. I looked around desperately and grabbed the broom from beside the refrigerator. I held it horizontally and used the handle to gently push against Doodle's chest, trying to guide him away from Dad. I talked to him in the calmest voice I could manage even though my heart was racing. For just a second his eyes seemed to clear and focus on my face. His tail did this tiny wag like he remembered me. But then his expression went blank again, and that glassy, unfocused look came back. I kept pushing steadily with the broom handle and talking in a soothing voice. Somehow I managed to guide him backward through the kitchen toward the laundry room. Dad ran ahead and threw the door open. As soon as Doodle crossed the threshold, Dad slammed it shut. Immediately we heard Doodle throw himself against the door from the inside. The whole frame shook with each impact, and we could hear his claws scraping against the wood. Dad dragged a kitchen chair over and wedged it under the doorknob at an angle. Mom was sobbing, saying we needed to call someone right now before Doodle hurt himself or broke through the door. Dad stood there staring at the shaking door with his face completely gray. He finally nodded and reached for his phone. But instead of calling Dr. Wolf or animal control, he dialed his brother who works as a lawyer. I could only hear Dad's side of the conversation, but he was asking questions about liability and what happens legally if a sick dog bites someone. He kept saying things like what if and how much trouble. His brother must have said something scary because Dad's face went even paler, and he sat down hard on one of the kitchen chairs. After he hung up, Dad announced that we were keeping Doodle locked in the laundry room until he calmed down naturally. Mom and I both started protesting at the same time, but Dad cut us off. He said calling the authorities would only make everything worse and we just needed to wait it out. I realized right then that he was more worried about getting in legal trouble than he was about anyone's actual safety. Mom tried arguing that Doodle needed help, but Dad refused to listen. He went to bed early saying he had a headache from all the stress. Mom followed him upstairs after giving me this helpless look. I waited in my room until I heard both of them snoring. Then I snuck downstairs as quietly as possible and went out to the garage. Dad had left his phone on the charger by his workbench. I unplugged it and pulled up his recent calls to find Mr. Capps' number. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone twice. I called the emergency number listed on the animal control card, and Mr. Capps answered on the second ring. I whispered everything about Doodle being locked in our laundry room and showing severe rabies symptoms. I told him about the foam and the aggression, and how Doodle had almost bitten Dad. Mr. Capps listened without interrupting, then said he would coordinate with the sheriff's department and Dr. Wolf to execute the warrant first thing in the morning. He told me to stay safe and keep my door locked tonight. I deleted the call from Dad's phone and put it back exactly where I found it, then went back to my room. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling with my phone clutched in my hand, just in case Barnaby called back. Every sound from downstairs made my stomach clench. Around midnight, I heard Doodle start snarling again, followed by the scraping of his claws against the laundry room door. The wood was probably getting shredded, but that was the least of our problems right now. I must have dozed off at some point because I jerked awake to silence, which felt way worse than the noise. My clock said 3:14 a.m., and the house was completely quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway in my socks, trying not to wake my parents. When I reached the laundry room door, I pressed my ear against it and held my breath. For a few seconds I heard nothing, and panic shot through me, thinking maybe Doodle had died in there. Then I caught the sound of his breathing, heavy and labored like each breath took effort. I stayed there listening for probably 5 minutes before going back to my room. Sleep was impossible after that, so I just sat on my bed watching the sky slowly get lighter through my window. When my alarm went off at 7, I was already dressed and had been for an hour. I heard Dad moving around downstairs and my whole body tensed up knowing what was about to happen. I waited in my room until I heard him in the kitchen making coffee. Then I forced myself to go down and face whatever was coming. Dad was standing by the counter staring at his phone with this weird expression on his face. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see in his eyes that he knew. He held up the phone showing the call log with Barnaby's number right there at 11:47 p.m. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. I expected him to yell or throw something, but instead he just looked at me with this mix of anger and defeat that was somehow worse than rage. He set the phone down carefully and walked past me without a word. His shoulders slumped like someone had knocked all the fight out of him. Mom came downstairs a few minutes later and I told her what I'd done. She didn't seem surprised, just nodded slowly and started making breakfast that nobody would eat. At exactly 9 o'clock, there was a firm knock on the front door that made all three of us jump. Through the window, I could see Barnaby standing on our porch next to a woman in scrubs who had to be Dr. Wolf. Behind them was a sheriff's deputy in full uniform with his hand resting on his belt. Dad's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he walked to the door and opened it. His jaw was so tight I could see the muscles working. Barnaby held up an official-looking document with the county seal at the top. He explained in this calm, professional voice that they had a warrant to seize and quarantine Doodle for rabies observation. Dr. Wolf stepped forward and started talking about public health emergencies and legal requirements for suspected rabies cases. Her voice was gentle but firm, like she'd done this before, and knew exactly how to handle resistant owners. The deputy's name tag said Hudson, and he didn't say anything, but his presence made it clear this wasn't optional. Dad started arguing about property rights and how the government couldn't just come take his dog. His voice was getting louder, and I could see his face turning red. Deputy Hudson cut him off in a tone that left no room for discussion. He explained very clearly that refusing to comply would result in Dad's immediate arrest for obstruction and child endangerment charges. Mom grabbed Dad's arm and said quietly to just let them take Doodle. Her voice was shaking, but she kept her hand on Dad's arm until he stopped talking. I showed them through the house to the laundry room, my legs feeling weird and disconnected like they belonged to someone else. Barnaby pulled out this long pole with a loop on the end from his truck. He positioned himself to the side of the door and nodded at Deputy Hudson, who stood ready with his hand near his gun. When they opened the door, Doodle came flying out so fast it was just a blur of golden fur and foam. He was snapping at the air and making these horrible sounds that didn't sound like any dog I'd ever heard. But Barnaby got the loop around his neck in one smooth motion and kept the pole extended so Doodle couldn't reach him. Doodle thrashed and twisted, his eyes wild and unfocused. Watching them walk him out to the animal control van parked in our driveway was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He was fighting the whole way, snarling and trying to bite the pole. This wasn't the dog who used to sleep curled up at the foot of my bed, or who would rest his head on my lap when I was sad. Dr. Wolf came over and put her hand on my shoulder. She said quietly that I did the right thing, and that I probably saved lives by making that call. Her eyes were kind, but also sad, like she'd seen this happen too many times. After they loaded Doodle into the van and drove away, the house felt empty in this awful way. Dad sat down on the couch and put his head in his hands. Mom was crying at the kitchen table but not making any sound, just tears running down her face. We all just sat there in different rooms, not talking for what felt like forever. Then Deputy Hudson came back inside and pulled out a notebook. He explained that both Dad and Mom would be receiving citations for animal cruelty and reckless endangerment. There was a court date in 3 weeks, and they would need to appear before a judge to answer the charges. He also said very strongly that Dad needed to start rabies shots immediately since he'd had close contact with Doodle's saliva when Doodle almost bit him. Dad tried to wave it off, saying Doodle never actually broke skin. Deputy Hudson's expression got even more serious, and he explained that it wasn't optional if there had been any potential exposure. He pulled out paperwork from the county health department with instructions on where to get the treatment. He warned that refusing could result in additional charges if Dad got sick and exposed other people. Mom spoke up right away, saying she would get the shots too, just to be safe. Her voice was steady for the first time all morning, like she'd finally found something she could control in this whole mess. Over the next 2 days, I stayed at my friend's house while things settled down at home. His parents didn't ask too many questions, just set up the guest room and told me I could stay as long as I needed. Liesl called my friend's cell phone twice a day to check on me. She walked me through what happened step by step, helping me understand that I made the right choice even though it felt awful. She said I showed real courage protecting my family and the community when my parents couldn't see the danger. Her voice was calm and steady each time we talked, like an anchor keeping me from drifting too far into guilt. I spent most of those 2 days playing video games with my friend and trying not to think about Doodle or what was happening at home. But my mind kept replaying the image of him thrashing in that catchpole, foam flying from his mouth as they loaded him into the van. On the 3rd day, Dr. Wolf called the house asking to speak with me. My friend's mom handed me the phone with a concerned look on her face. Dr. Wolf's voice was gentle, but I could hear the sadness underneath when she told me Doodle tested positive for rabies. They had to put him down to complete the testing because that's the only way to confirm rabies for sure. She said she was so sorry, but it was necessary to protect public health and make sure everyone who had contact with him could get proper treatment. I thanked her for calling and hung up, then went to the guest room and cried for over an hour. I cried for the sweet golden retriever who used to curl up on my bed every night. I cried for the horrible way he died, scared and aggressive and nothing like himself. I cried because my parents' stubbornness had killed him just as surely as the virus did. The health department launched a full investigation into everyone who had contact with Doodle over the past 2 weeks. Jeffrey Hudson's young son had to start the complete rabies shot series as a safety measure since Doodle had tried to bite him through the fence. Jeffrey and his wife Monica were furious with my dad, understandably so. Their kid had to get painful shots in his stomach because my parents refused to give Doodle his medication. The mailman also needed treatment after Doodle cornered him during a delivery. I heard through my friend's mom that there was talk of civil lawsuits from multiple people. The county was building a case file with witness statements and veterinary records. Every person Doodle had contact with had to be tracked down and warned about potential exposure. When I finally went home 4 days after they took Doodle away, the house felt completely wrong without him. It was too quiet and empty in a way that made my chest hurt. Dad was on his 3rd rabies shot and having bad side effects that left him exhausted and sick to his stomach. He spent most of his time in bed or on the couch looking gray and miserable. Mom had been cleaning obsessively, scrubbing every surface Doodle might have touched with bleach and disinfectant. The house smelled like chemicals, and the laundry room door stood open showing the bare floor where his bed used to be. She'd thrown out his food bowls, toys, and collar. Every trace of him was gone like he'd never existed. That evening, my parents and I had the most awkward conversation of my life sitting around the kitchen table. Dad admitted he'd been scared about the vet bills piling up and convinced himself that natural healing would work instead. He showed me some of the online forums he'd been reading, full of people claiming veterinarians were just trying to make money off worried pet owners. The posts talked about dogs healing themselves through fasting and natural immunity, with success stories that sounded too good to be true. He said he wanted to believe it because we couldn't afford hundreds of dollars in vet care on top of everything else. Mom said she should have trusted her own instincts instead of going along with Dad's plan. She knew something was seriously wrong with Doodle, but she let Dad convince her to wait it out. Her voice shook when she said she'd never forgive herself for not speaking up sooner. 3 weeks later, the court date arrived, and we all drove to the county courthouse in complete silence. My parents had hired a lawyer who worked out a deal with the prosecutor ahead of time. They pleaded guilty to reduced charges of animal cruelty and reckless endangerment in exchange for probation, fines, and mandatory animal welfare education classes. The judge was stern-faced and serious when he talked about the severity of letting a rabid animal go untreated. But he noted that no humans were ultimately bitten and that my parents were cooperating fully with all health department requirements. He sentenced them to 2 years probation, $1,500 in fines, and 60 hours of animal welfare education. He also banned them from owning any pets for 5 years. Dad's jaw was tight when he agreed to the terms, but he signed all the paperwork without arguing. Jeffrey and Monica Hudson decided not to pursue a civil lawsuit after my parents agreed to pay for all their son's rabies treatment costs. That came to almost $3,000 for the full shot series and medical monitoring. The mailman was still considering legal action, but his union lawyer was handling it, so we didn't know what would happen there. Our neighbors were polite when we saw them outside, but kept their distance now. Nobody stopped to chat when we checked the mail or worked in the yard. I didn't blame them one bit for being cautious around our family after what happened. I started seeing Liesl regularly at the school to work through everything that happened. We met in her office twice a week during my study hall period. She helped me process the trauma of watching Doodle get sicker and more dangerous every day. She also worked with me on the guilt I felt about having him taken away, even though I knew it was the right choice. Liesl was patient and never rushed me through the hard emotions. She helped me understand that I didn't cause any of this situation. I responded the best way I could to an impossible crisis that my parents created through their choices. She said most teenagers wouldn't have had the courage to go against their parents to protect everyone involved. Dad completed his animal welfare classes 2 months after the court date and came home with a completely different attitude about pet care. He showed me the educational materials about recognizing serious illness in animals and the critical importance of veterinary medicine. The classes covered rabies specifically, with photos and case studies that were hard to look at. He learned about the progression of symptoms and how quickly the virus attacks the nervous system once it takes hold. One evening he sat down with me and actually apologized for putting his pride and his wallet ahead of Doodle's life and my safety. He said he'd been so focused on proving he was right that he couldn't see what was really happening until it was too late. Mom started attending a support group for people who had experienced family crises and traumatic events. She went every Thursday evening at the community center and came home looking tired but somehow lighter. She was working on setting boundaries with Dad and speaking up when she disagreed, instead of just going along with whatever he decided. Their relationship was different now, more honest, but also more tense in ways I could see during dinner conversations. They talked through decisions instead of Dad just announcing what would happen. It was awkward sometimes, but better than the blind agreement that had led to Doodle's death. 3 months after everything happened, I filled out an application at Pet's Paradise, the local pet store near the grocery plaza. The manager called me back the same day, and I started the following weekend stocking shelves and cleaning animal enclosures. Being around the parrots and hamsters and fish tanks felt good in a way I didn't expect. My first week I noticed one of the guinea pigs sitting hunched in the corner not eating his pellets. I told my boss and she checked him over, finding an infected tooth that needed treatment. She asked how I knew to look for that, and I explained about watching Doodle get sick, learning to spot the small signs. She nodded slowly and said that kind of awareness was rare in teenage employees. By my second month, she had me helping customers pick out proper supplies and answering questions about pet health. I'd explain about nutrition labels and the importance of regular vet checkups, thinking about how different things might have been if my parents had listened to that advice. The paychecks weren't huge, but I opened a savings account at the bank across from the school. I deposited most of each check, keeping only enough for lunch money and gas. The account was labeled College Fund, and I'd check the balance on my phone, watching the numbers climb slowly. I started researching veterinary medicine programs and animal welfare degrees, printing out information about admission requirements and course descriptions. One afternoon, Dr. Wolf stopped by the pet store to buy food for her own dogs. She saw me restocking the leash display and came over to say hello. We talked about my job, and she mentioned that her clinic was looking for volunteers to help with basic tasks like cleaning kennels and assisting with exams. She said I could start once I turned 16 in a few months, learning hands-on about veterinary work. I thanked her about 5 times and she laughed, saying I'd earned the opportunity by handling an impossible situation with courage. At home, things were slowly getting better with my parents, but everything felt different from before. I didn't trust them the same automatic way I used to, and they knew it. Dad started including me in conversations about bills and money worries, showing me the budget spreadsheet and asking my opinion on where to cut expenses. He'd explain why certain things cost more than expected and admit when he'd made mistakes with spending. It was weird having that much information about adult problems, but also better than being kept in the dark. Mom asked my input on family decisions too, like where to go for dinner or what movie to watch. Small stuff, but it showed they were trying to treat me more like an equal. Dinner conversations were still awkward sometimes, with long silences and careful word choices, but at least we were talking honestly instead of pretending everything was fine. One Saturday afternoon, Jeffrey Hudson knocked on our front door, holding a plate covered in foil. I answered, and he smiled, saying his son had finished all the rabies shots with no problems. The doctor said there were no lasting effects and he was completely healthy. Jeffrey thanked me for calling animal control when I did, saying the situation could have been much worse if Doodle had actually bitten someone. His wife Monica had baked chocolate chip cookies as a peace offering and wanted us to have them. I took the plate and thanked him, feeling relieved that they didn't hate us anymore. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other neighbors being friendlier too, waving when we checked the mail and stopping to chat about normal things like weather and lawn care. The tension that had hung over our street for months was finally easing. Liesl asked me to write a detailed account of everything that happened with Doodle for the school records. I spent a week typing it all out, describing the symptoms I noticed and how my parents reacted and what made me finally call for help. It was hard reliving those weeks, but also helpful to organize everything in writing. I gave Liesl the document, and she said it was incredibly valuable for understanding how students cope with dangerous home situations. A month later, she told me the school district's crisis response team was using my account as a case study for training counselors. They wanted to teach other adults how to recognize when teenagers need help, but are scared to ask directly. Knowing my experience might help other kids in similar situations made the whole nightmare feel less pointless. 6 months after losing Doodle, I drove to Riverside Park and sat on the wooden bench where we used to rest during our evening walks. I brought the red collar he wore as a puppy, before we got him the bigger adult one. The leather was cracked and faded, but I could still see his name stamped on the tag. I sat there for an hour just remembering the good years before everything went wrong. How he'd sleep at the foot of my bed and steal socks from the laundry basket and get excited about car rides. It was sad, but also peaceful, like I was finally able to say goodbye properly instead of just having him ripped away. I left the collar hanging on the bench armrest, a small memorial in his favorite spot. Dad got a raise at work that fall and surprised us by making a donation to the county animal shelter. He showed me the receipt, $500 given in Doodle's name to help other animals get proper medical care. It was his way of making amends, and while it didn't fix what happened, it showed he was genuinely trying to do better. The shelter sent a thank you card and put Doodle's name on their donor wall. Mom cried when she saw it. Around the same time, Liesl started connecting me with younger students who were dealing with tough family situations. Nothing as extreme as mine, but kids who felt stuck or scared or confused about problems at home. I'd meet with them during lunch period and just listen, sharing parts of my story when it seemed helpful. One kid's parents were fighting constantly and he didn't know how to handle it. Another girl's mom had started drinking too much and she felt responsible for fixing it. I told them what I'd learned about asking adults for help and recognizing when situations were beyond their control. Knowing I could help others made me feel less powerless about everything I'd been through. My parents completed their probation requirements 4 months ahead of schedule. They attended extra animal welfare education sessions voluntarily and paid off all the fines early. At the final court hearing, the judge reviewed their file and noted their exceptional compliance. He officially closed their case and said he was impressed by their commitment to making things right. They thanked him quietly, and we left the courthouse looking relieved but also humbled. Dad said later that he'd never forget how close we came to causing a real tragedy. The acceptance letter from State Veterinary College arrived in March for their summer program. It was a 6-week intensive for high school students interested in animal medicine, with hands-on learning and college credit. Dr. Wolf had written my recommendation letter describing how I handled the crisis with Doodle and recognized the symptoms other people missed. I got accepted along with 19 other students from across the state. I was excited and nervous about starting this new path, knowing it came from the worst experience of my life, but feeling ready to turn it into something positive. The program starts in 6 weeks, and I've been preparing by reading veterinary textbooks from the library and watching surgery videos online. Mom notices me studying at the kitchen table one evening and sits down across from me, something she never would have done before when she was just going along with whatever Dad said. She asks what I'm learning, and I explain about canine anatomy and common health problems, and she actually listens and asks follow-up questions instead of just nodding. Dad comes in from work and joins the conversation, admitting he wishes he'd paid more attention to Doodle's symptoms instead of pretending everything was fine. They tell me they've been seeing a couples therapist every Tuesday to work on their communication and decision-making, and I can see it's actually helping because they're talking to each other honestly now instead of just agreeing to avoid conflict. The house feels different these days, lighter somehow, like we're not all walking on eggshells waiting for the next crisis. We have family dinners where we actually discuss problems instead of ignoring them, and when Dad got worried about a big expense last month, he told us about it instead of making some reckless decision to avoid it. 3 weeks later, Mom suggests we plant a tree for Doodle on what would have been his 13th birthday. Dad surprises me by agreeing immediately, even getting emotional about it, which I've never seen from him before. We drive to the nursery together and pick out a young dogwood tree with white flowers, and Dad insists on paying for it himself. In the backyard, we take turns digging the hole, and Mom brings out a photo album of Doodle from when he was a puppy. We share our favorite memories while planting the tree, laughing about the time he ate an entire birthday cake off the counter and how he used to steal socks from the laundry basket. Dad tells a story about Doodle learning to swim that I'd never heard before, his voice cracking a little. Mom cries, but in a good way, saying she's sorry she didn't fight harder to get him proper care. I tell them I forgive them, and that I know they were scared and confused, and we stand there together looking at the newly planted tree. Senior year starts in 2 weeks, and I'm heading into it with clear goals about becoming a veterinarian and helping other animals. My family isn't perfect, and we never will be, but we're honest with each other now about our fears and mistakes. I know I have the strength to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, even when it means going against people I love. The whole terrible experience with Doodle taught me that sometimes loving someone means making the hardest choice to keep everyone safe, and I would do it again if I had to. And that's the wrap-up for this one. I always try to leave you with something to think about, not just something to listen to. And hopefully there's at least one piece you'll carry with you. Subscribe so the next story finds you.